Hello and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today we're going to look at the significance of the EU-India Free Trade Agreement signed this year after nearly 20 years of negotiations and the accompanying security and defence partnership. With so much geopolitical bad news around for Europe, this agreement looks like a rare strategic win. Well, Incredible India was the slogan of a long-running campaign to promote the world's most populous country as a tourism destination. There was indeed something incredible about the colourful ceremony at which the presidents of the European Commission and the European Council signed what Ursula von der Leyen called the mother of all deals with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on India's Independence Day in January. It brings together two economies that represent roughly 1/4 of the world's population, most of them Indian, and 1/5 of world GDP. And constitutes, in the words of the European Commission, the most ambitious trade opening that India has ever granted to a trade partner. In a new era of predatory great power rivalry, tariff wars and weaponization of raw material, here were two huge democracies sealing a rules-based agreement that offers mutual economic benefit and the makings of a security partnership. What's not to like? Well, with bilateral trade in goods and services already worth 180 billion euros, the EU says that the FTA will enable it to double exports to India by 2032. Yet, as my EPC colleague Rajnish Singh wrote, the deal is less about economics than about geopolitics. Its conclusion after such a long gestation has been driven in large part by shifting geopolitical pressures from Washington and Beijing, which have forced Brussels and New Delhi to reassess their own strategic positioning. The EU watered down some of its environmental standards for the sake of opening the massive and fast-growing Indian market and trying to draw India away from its historical partnership with Russia, its biggest arms and oil supplier. India, for its part, is trying to diversify its trade, defense procurement, and security relationships to counter China's rising power and US President Donald Trump's aggressive tariffs. So how big a deal is the India-EU agreement? What economic prospects does it open? What are the main impediments to trade and investment? What does this deal mean for the international trading system? And what are the strategic benefits given persistent differences over Russia's war in Ukraine and the global North-South relations? With me to discuss these issues, I'm delighted to welcome Sonia Prashar, Secretary-General of the Federation of European Business in India, and Almut Möller, my boss, Director for Global and European Affairs and Head of the Europe in the World programme here at the EPC. Welcome to both of you. Sonia, let me start with you and ask, how big an economic deal is this for India and for Europe, and what potential obstacles still have to be overcome?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Almut, for inviting me today to your podcast. Very delighted to be here today. Paul, you said, how big an economic deal is this for Europe and India, or let's say EU and India? The economic scale between both India and EU itself is setting the context for the trade negotiations, which took 20 years to be concluded, and the potential impact of the FTA. You mentioned bilateral trade 180, I say 200 billion euro, bilateral trade in goods and services, 2 billion people together, and two largest democracies aiming for rule-based, predictable, transparent business environment. And in fact, these are the big elements of this economic deal. The FTA, which was very long awaited, is a very comprehensive and a very ambitious one. And this is described as highly comprehensive. Why? Because it's covering 20 pillars, including goods, services, digital trade, sustainable development, intellectual property, dispute settlement. And inclusions also of modern issues like digital trade, sustainability, rapid response mechanisms for trade disruptions is particularly very notable. And why is it big? Because both sides are offering substantial tariff reductions. For me, it was almost like renewing your marriage vows when I saw Prime Minister Modi and President Ursula von der Leyen, showing their excitement and exhilaration on negotiating the negotiation conclusion coming to an end after 20 years. Now, for example, the EU will offer something like 90.7% of its trade value immediately duty-free, while India will liberalize 97.5% of its trade value. So many sectors will see tariffs drop to zero in a phased-out manner, including products like marine, chemicals, textiles, and machinery. You also asked about the potential obstacles which will remain to overcome. And I would say the agreement includes pathways for handling contentious issues like the EU's CBAM, rapid response mechanisms for trade dispute disruptions, and provisions for non-violation complaints. Now, this shows a forward-looking, flexible approach, and I'm very, very confident that we will navigate our way through these contentious topics as well.
Well, I'm sure all our listeners know what CBAM is, but just in case they don't, it's the EU's carbon tax, essentially, on imports, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And it affects particularly countries like India, potentially, because India has a high reliance on fossil fuels, especially coal. So that's obviously one issue that could flare. How long will it take before this agreement actually enters into force? Is it already provincially being applied? And what still has to come in the way of ratification?
Right now, we have the legal text published. As you know, it's going under legal scrubbing, as they say. Let's say a better word could be legal reviewing. And both sides would aim to sign by the end of the year, which means after signing, it should go for the ratification by the EU Parliament. And both sides are, again, hoping very optimistically, like all Indians are very optimistic here, by middle of 2027, that we should see the ratification and entry into force. So it can always take 1 to 2 years, but we're very hopeful for mid-2027 for entry into force.
Okay, so what's India hoping for, particularly in terms of investment and technology from this agreement in the civilian and the defense sectors? And what difficulties do European companies have to navigate when they're doing business with India?
I would say, first of all, most important two complementary pillars to this FTA is one is that it is guided by the India-EU Joint Comprehensive Strategic Agenda. I think that's a very important complementary pillar to this FTA. The second one is the Trade and Technology Council, which is also acting as a complementary pillar to establish a comprehensive, tech-driven and resilient partnership. And also, there are some mechanisms which have been integrated to address the challenges. And that way, I would say it is like a living agreement approach. So the FTA is designed to be dynamic with built-in review and consultation mechanisms to adapt to future challenges, technological challenges, and regulatory developments. Coming back to your question, I would say India is hoping for a stronger partnership. There are about 6,000 businesses active in India today, 6,000 EU businesses active in India today, and then generating about 3.7 million direct jobs. India is hoping with this FTA that more and more small and medium-sized companies from EU would look at India more decisively now. And the comprehensive coverage of trade pillars, they are underscoring the strategic importance of this partnership which India is looking in terms of industrial manufacturing, critical materials, clean technologies, semiconductors, digital ecosystems, and so on. And most importantly, the resilient supply chains, with the agreement being repositioned as probably as one instrument among several others with targeted investments and regulated coordination. So what stands out most is the scale and the ambition of this FTA. It is broad, It is modern, and most important, it is flexible. And especially when you work with India, you need a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. People talk about bureaucracy as one of the biggest hurdles that people have to address when they're doing business in India. I've talked to people who've worked there and who say that it's just staggering the number of rules and stamps that have to be obtained and so on. How is that going to be addressed by this agreement?
I would personally say that bureaucracy is running all around in all systems in the world today, and not necessarily and particularly in India. India is at the next level of development. What we've seen is most of the EU businesses have been investing mostly in 5 to 6 states out of the 28 states and plus union territories in India. And that is mostly in the state of Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Andhra, Telangana. So out of 28 states, I'm picking up only 5 to 6 states. And when the next level of the development is happening in India, the balanced states are looking for more new investments, are looking for new engagement from new businesses. There will be, of course, some bureaucratic hurdles. But to be honest, the fact that 6,000 new businesses are active already in India today, whereas the number could be much more in the coming years, it's already a testament of the fact that India could be a complex market, but it is definitely not a complicated market. If you understand Europe, you can understand India even better. And that is why we say we are natural strategic partners. It's not a cliched saying. It's a fact that when you move from the north of India to the south of India, from the east of India to the west of India, there are different, mentalities. There are different languages, different cultures, yet one country, one democracy, which is entirely today in the world to say, come and work with us and develop and co-create for the world.
Well, I love your optimism. We don't get much of that on the podcast these days. I'm going to turn to Almut now. How would you evaluate the geopolitical significance of this agreement? What message does it send to the United States, to Russia, to China?
Well, I think most importantly, it was a reassurance for Europe and the European Commission, European member states, that we can actually do this. We can forge ties with a very important, fast-growing economy where there are areas of like-mindedness and, as was pointed out, also areas where we disagree, that in these turbulent times, the Union came out to stabilize together with India, not within a few months, but with a significant boost after many years and probably since 2021, political attention at highest levels to one another to really tie the knot with quite some fanfare that in its symbolism, I think, is very important for Europeans. We can do it. We are engaging with an economy that is looking into the future much more than is felt in Europe these days, and Europe cannot afford not to be part of that. So it's in that spirit, and you entitled your podcast, Paul, Incredible India, you could almost sense that feeling of, the leaders, European leaders that were hosted in Delhi for the official ceremony, that, this is meaningful, there's human interaction suddenly. European Council President Antonio Costa himself having a background in India with roots going there, there was suddenly sort of a human element to it where Europeans felt we can do it. Now, of course, proof is in the pudding. I mean, delivery is important, as Sonia has been pointing out. An infrastructure is built in terms of institutions, including the one that Sonia represents here, to fill that agreement with life. We have probably a ratification process that matches Europe's ambition to really deliver faster than it has done in the past. So I think we can talk about that, how it's all lined up in Brussels. But then, of course, this needs to be filled with life. And for me, the infrastructure as such, having institutions like, the ones that Sonia described in the economic realm, but also when it comes to security and defense, a broader strategic agenda, that is a framework that is very helpful. But of course, that needs to be filled with life because in broader, geopolitical terms, I mean, India, as the European Union, is kind of trying to navigate what is really quite a chaotic globe at the moment. And if you look at, for instance, key partnerships, Paul, as you were asking with regard to the United States, the Indian leadership has invested quite a bit in a good relationship, and Europeans have done the same. But does that make us immune, to changes and shifts in U.S. policies that happen at times overnight? No. So this experience is hitting the Indians, it is hitting the Europeans. There are other, of course, developments around the globe, including in our shared neighborhood, which is, from the European perspective, called the Middle East. So the Strait of Hormuz, everything that prevents the flow of energy, difficulties for the Indians to power their fast-growing economy. I mean, the outlook on those matters, relations with Russia, as Paul, you were saying, which is a strong pressure point for the Europeans, that India brings a very clear experience and legacy of a partnership out of its own right. I mean, there is a lot of things that I'm sure will emerge in the framework institutions that show divergence rather than intuitively convergence. But for me, it's very important that, as an analyst who cares about, how this world of chaos can hopefully navigate towards something that makes more sense to more, rather than a chaos that benefits only few. I think India and Europe should really deeply care about listening to one another, how they make sense, and trying to move into that space together to understand each other a lot more. And here, incredible India, I think, is something that needs to be understood more in Europe than it has been understood in the past, because as Sonia has been pointing out, it's a very, very complex country with a rich history and its own logic and its own domestic pressures, of course. And that, I think, is something that Europe, on its side, needs to invest in understanding more with the infrastructure of knowledge institutions, with the infrastructure of our presence in India. And this is something the EPC, of course, cares about, given we are a think tank, to work with like-minded partners in that space.
Yeah, you didn't mention China there. Is there a message to China in all of this?
Well, at the moment, I think there might be implicitly understood messaging. I don't think there was a very clear messaging on the side of the EU. We want to show something to China, but there was an interest in navigating an environment where our relationship with China obviously is a complex one. And the Indians have their own complicated relationship, given there is probably, Sonia, I would call it sort of economic pragmatism, but in geopolitical terms, there's tension and rivalry and difficulty. And for the European side, I think this is something also, of course, to understand when you want to understand India. The Indians will probably tell us when we go, well, welcome to the world. Our neighborhood is one of conflict. Surprise, surprise. And here, I think, of course, it helps Europeans in economic terms to have now a relationship of the kind of the FTA with India when it comes to, the Chinese markets imposing a lot of pressure on the Europeans to flood their markets, etc., with products. It's good to work on choices. This is what Europe has been doing. And this is also what India has been doing. And this is, I think, important also to understand. In Europe, we probably will focus more on India's engagement as part of the G20 and the leadership and the UN environment, the WTO, where Europeans and Indians meet and engage. And there is the hope that India might sort of navigate closer to European, American sort of views, which hasn't happened. But we're looking less at how India, of course, is having alternatives to its cooperative infrastructure in that, an important role in the BRICS, including this year, with a leading role, and, investing in options. And so while Europeans and Indians alike are investing in options and trying to sort of pull their weight, the question is, can they, and I think they should, create a space where there is greater convergence? Because if India and the European Union move collectively, they have a strong potential to be a stabilizer in global environments. Is this happening at this point in time? I don't think we're anywhere near that. I think, and this is not to water down what Sonia said in terms of opportunity, but I think there is an argument that says both sides would probably not want to lock in too early into choices either. And that is also quite a rational behavior. So from a European perspective, I think it will be just good to invest more into becoming more relevant in India's calculation over global governance. And I think the infrastructure that we have now with the renewed open FTA corridor is one opportunity to also make that happen.
What areas do you see for cooperation in the security and defense dimension? Are there things that Europe can buy from India to strengthen its defenses, reduce perhaps its industrial dependence on the United States? Or what can India buy from European nations to modernize its defenses and reduce its dependence on Russia, maybe?
Well, I think, Sonia, from an economic perspective, I think, you can have that view to say, well, there is scale, there is interesting tech innovation, that India can offer. So from a purely economic perspective and trade perspective, I think, there is possibly a lot in there. On the sort of the reality of things, I am quite hesitant. I see that given the fact that, the Indians have been out of their own right, in their own regional environment, involved in their own history of security partnerships, et cetera, in an environment where at the moment Europeans feel so vulnerable and are literally under attack with a war of aggression that has been raging for almost 5 years, that's gone into its 5th year recently. This is an area that requires a lot of trust. And while there is a lot to discover, a lot to learn, a lot to export, sort of weaving each other into supply chains, that is potentially an opportunity. My hunch is that at this point in time, there is probably not enough trust building and understanding for, to really grow that into something meaningful fast. But, I'm not saying we cannot get there. And we have recently put together a compendium of views, including on security and defense, cooperation in the maritime sector. All analysts are telling us it's not wrong to go together into that space and to look into it. And the new security and defense partnership that was launched, the first meeting, I think, took place in March in Delhi. This is all a good development as the European Union is also developing its resources, Paul, as you very well know, in security and defense. But this is very much a moving piece on the EU side as well. So I'm more hesitant in that space right now.
Well, now I have a question for both of you. I was at the Delphi Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk of this proposed future India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, the IMEC, as it's called. Like other acronyms, the people in the know just call it by its acronym, and the rest of us have to figure out what the hell they're talking about. So I went and scratched and tried to find out what the substance of the IMAC is. How feasible do you think such a grand project is in the light of the wars involving the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, which are still simmering and could erupt again at any stage? And is that important to the EU-India relationship, or is it just a sort of peripheral nice to have? Sonia.
The project, the corridor itself, is of huge strategic priority, both for India and EU. From my point of view, for deeper integration into the global supply chains, integrated electricity grids, green energy flow, high-speed data connectivity, benefiting all economies. We saw a lot of momentum in the last 6 to, let's say, 9 months. And I have to admit, there is a bit of silence right now for the reasons we all know. But if it were to happen, I think it would establish absolutely fantastic trade and green energy hubs and expanding the EU-India economic partnership. And its full potential realization obviously today hinges on certain critical factors. And I'm only hoping and I pray that somehow the dialogue proceeds further, because it's a win-win for all the players. But nobody can guess what is happening tomorrow. So we're only being optimistic about it. And if it happens, I see a huge benefit.
Almut, is it a pipe dream, or is it something that you could hang your hat on in the next decade?
In the spirit of what I said previously, in that Europeans would be well advised to take seriously what India puts forward as serious interest, I think it will be important to keep political attention to this. Obviously, infrastructure projects, very complex, and this is a very ambitious idea. But as far as I can see, and Sonia now reaffirmed that, it continues to play a strong role in the Indian context, and it should also, therefore, in the European context. Do I see enough political attention on this right now? I don't, for obvious reasons. But I think this is an area where we can show via, engagement and political conversations that we take seriously a connectivity interest that the Indian partners have. And without denying the complexity of it, not abandon it and put it into a closet and no longer talk about it. It's a broader strategic subject that requires attention, and it should receive that attention. But as we know, Paul, the EU is also a complex beast, and that requires buy-in from member states, for which I see certain member states sort of signing up to it and others less. So it would probably require more of a push. At the moment, the priorities are clearly on the quick gains and wins on the FTA. And if Europe, I think, managed to press ahead with ratification, where on the Indian side it's easier, I think it's a government decision essentially, we can impress, because the expectation in India, I believe, is not that we can wait forever. In many conversations that I have, I get the sense that, the complexity and the long time it takes to conclude and decide on things. The Mercosur, that was a strange vote that went wrong in the European Parliament on an agreement, similar relevance, of course. I mean, these things are all noticed, and the Europeans have the chance now to benefit from an accelerated pressure also on its own machinery to kind of really deliver. And that is the focus of this year. And if this succeeds with a high level visit from the Indian side, I think that's a good enough result.
Well, there we have it. Huge potential, a need to keep a long-term perspective, but to do the work in the meantime to make sure that this deal stays on the rails in this relationship. That's all we have time for this week, but you can find more about the EU-India relations, including the compendium we mentioned with contributions by Almut and Sonia, and the commentary I mentioned by Rajneesh Singh on our website, www.epc.eu. Sonia will be next month at our Brussels Economic Security Forum for those of you who'd like to meet her. And The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time with more on the struggle for economic security. Until then, I'll say thanks to my colleague Simona Luswadi for helping to organize and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.